I have started recording this meeting, so if you have any concerns about privacy, you'd like to keep your camera off, by all means. I just want to let you know that this meeting will be recorded and then eventually will be uploaded to the center's YouTube channel. Good, why don't we get started? Good evening, my name is Francesca Bregoli. I am the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to our third public event of the fall semester. It's so nice to see so many friends on this Zoom call and also many new faces. And if you would like to learn more about the Center for Jewish Studies at the GC, please email us. I will put the email in the chat box momentarily, and we will make sure to put you on our mailing list so you can get updates about our upcoming programs, and you can also follow us on Facebook. This evening's program will feature a conversation between Professors Marina Rustow and Arnold Franklin about Marina's most recent book, The Lost Archive: Traces of a Caliphate in a Cairo Synagogue, which was published by Princeton University Press. This is a gorgeous book. I have a copy here, and I wish I could show you in person how exquisite this book is. It's lavishly illustrated with photographs of geniza documents. And of course, we will hear much more about the actual contents tonight. But I want to alert you to a 30% discount that is currently being offered on the book by Princeton. And you will find the code in the chat box again momentarily. So just a few words about the way in which the event is going to run. We will start with an introduction by Professor Rustow. This will be followed by a conversation between her and Arnold Franklin. And towards the end of the program, there will also be an opportunity for questions. And we have a fairly large audience tonight, so please use the chat box to write your question, and I will make sure to read it. I will read your name and your question at the end of the program. Again, this event will be recorded and later it will be uploaded to the center's YouTube channel. I want to invite you to keep your microphones muted throughout the main portion of the event. Please feel free to turn your camera off if you have any concerns about privacy. And now, without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. I'm so delighted to introduce Marina Rustow, who's not just an overall awesome person and scholar, but also a dear friend. She is the Keduri Zilcha Professor of Jewish Civilization in the Near East and Professor of Near Eastern Studies and History at Princeton University, where she is also the director of the Princeton Geniza Lab and of the Near Eastern Studies program. Her work focuses on the study of Judeo-Arabic documents found in the Cairo Geniza and the history of Jews in the Fatimid Caliphate. Before joining Princeton, she taught at Emory and Johns Hopkins University. She received a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2014 and was selected as a MacArthur Fellow in 2015 for her work in, and here I'm quoting, rewriting our understanding of medieval Jewish life and transforming the historical study of the Fatimid Empire. Professor Rustow's first book is Heresy and the Politics of Community: The Jews of the Fatimid Caliphate, published by Cornell University Press. I'm also delighted that Arnold Franklin, my colleague, my dear colleague at Queens College, was able to join us tonight. He is an associate professor of history and the director of the Jewish Studies program at Queens College, CUNY. Previously, he taught at New York University, the University of California, Davis, and Hunter College. Professor Franklin specializes in medieval Jewish history, Jews in the Islamic world, and the Cairo Geniza. He is the author of This Noble House, Jewish Descendants of King David in the Islamic East, published by Penn Press, which explores the concern with lineage that developed among Jews living in Muslim lands during the Middle Ages. So without further ado, Marina, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Francesca. And thank you, Arnold, also for being here. Francesca, I was watching the face of my editor from Princeton Press, Fred Appel, beaming as you were describing the book as being lavishly illustrated. So that's wonderful to hear. It's really nice to be here. There are a lot of names of people I know out there on this call, and that's really lovely to see. And it's great to be here. So it's also great to be here because in January 2016, Francesca was kind enough to invite me to give a lecture at CUNY. And although I didn't know it at the time, that lecture was a 45-minute précis of the book, but I didn't really know that I was writing this book yet. I thought I was writing a different book. So I'm not going to do that now. Instead, I'm going to give you a 15-minute précis of the book, starting with its cover. So this is the cover of the book, and you know, designers are able to do really brilliant things with illustrations, and so I just want to show you what happened with this one. This was actually part of a page of a manuscript of a work that's actually later and more East than what the book itself covers. But it's good to see this in context. What's depicted here are two angels. You can tell that they're angels by their wings, and this is based on a surah from the Quran that talks about the angels seated at the right and the left of humans when at the divine judgment. But these angels are depicted as writing decrees, governmental decrees, almost as though they're bureaucrats. And you can tell that they're governmental decrees because they're very long sheets of paper with calligraphic Arabic with very wide line spacing. And when I saw this, I knew that this had to be on the cover of the book, and you'll see why in a minute. So the corner of the world that I work on is the Fatimid Caliphate, basically the Islamic Mediterranean from the 10th to the 12th centuries. And this was a world in which the Abbasids, who are depicted here in lavender of various shades, had ruled the entire Islamic world from about 750 onward. And in 929, an upstart caliphate arose in Ifriqiya, Central North Africa. That's what you see in green here. So if this was the Islamic world in the early 10th century, by the late 10th century, it looked like this, right? So I'm just gonna run through that one more time. No, I can't find the control, so I'm not gonna back up. But anyway, you get the idea. Basically, the Fatimids were the main power in the Mediterranean. And they were also the dynasty that founded Cairo. So the city of Cairo proper, they founded in 969 when they conquered Egypt, and it became their Palatine complex, and then eventually got englobed into the larger twin city of Fustat and Cairo. And I'll show you an inset map in a second. But the main thing to know about the Fatimids is that in introductions to the medieval Middle East, they're often dismissed as heretics or somehow exceptional, as if we can ignore them in favor of the presumably more important Sunni dynasties. But in fact, their contemporaries would not have found them nearly so easy to dismiss. And one of them, a geographer named al-Maqdisi, who lived in Palestine in the 10th century, actually saw all of this happening. He saw the Fatimid conquest and wrote that Baghdad has been superseded until the Day of Judgment, Baghdad being the capital that the Abbasids had founded. Egypt's metropole has now become the greatest glory of the Muslims. So there was a consciousness even among contemporaries that the Fatimids had changed the world and moved its economic and cultural powerhouse to Egypt. But I didn't start out thinking that I was going to study the Fatimids. I think most people who take up the Cairo geniza don't imagine that they're going to have to get to know the Fatimids well. And I got to them because of the geniza. So for those of you who haven't had the pleasure, here's a brief introduction to the geniza. And for those of you who have had the pleasure, and I know there are some experts out there, please forgive me for this. So what you see on this inset map is the city of Cairo in the north that was founded by the Fatimids in 969. And then in the south, you see Fustat. So this is on the banks of the Nile. Fustat was the residential core. If Cairo was where the Caliphate palace was and where the Caliphate family lived, Fustat was a place that was where the regular people lived. It was a dense residential core. Buildings could run to 6-7 stories high. If you want like an equivalent, think about maybe the ghetto in Venice, except this wasn't a ghetto because this wasn't just Jews or just anybody. It was a completely mixed population. This was the residential core of what later became Cairo. Within this inset map, you see some yellow buildings. Those are medieval churches that still exist that you can visit today. And then there's one blue building, which is the Ben Ezra Synagogue. Now it's called the Ben Ezra. At the time, it was called something different. And that is where a large cache of manuscripts was found over the course of the late 19th century and dispersed to various libraries. So the concept of a geniza, at least this is what I was always told, was a storage chamber for worn text that may contain the name of God in Hebrew script. And in fact, that has much to do with the modern practice of geniza as Jews today practice it. But in fact, there is a much more complicated story about how people in the Middle East in general would store their manuscripts. And you know, this is a story that goes beyond Jews, as we're now starting to understand as more of these caches start to emerge. The basic overview, most of the material that emerged from the geniza dates to a really convenient period for historians between 950 and 1250. Convenient because this was an era of Jewish history about which we didn't have a whole lot of information, or at least not from the Islamic East. The grand total is about 400,000 pages or fragments of pages, about 90% of which are texts that were meant for posterity. And I'm putting books in quotation marks because books could take many forms in the Middle Ages. So this is a fragment of a book as we know it, right? So you can see the fold down the center. This was what medievalists call a codex, and this is as well, this one is in Arabic script, but there were many other forms of the book, fragments of which were found in the geniza. The other 10% are documents, and nobody's cataloged all of these things. We still don't know to a great extent what's actually what was in the geniza, but the best we can do is kind of estimate, and the current estimate that I'm giving for documents is 40,000. It turns out that not everything in the geniza that was found was in Hebrew script. So I just showed you a book fragment in Arabic script. This is a document in Hebrew script. This is another typical letter in Hebrew script. You can immediately know that it's a letter because of the diagonal words in the right-hand margin, which my teacher and Arnold Franklin's teacher, Mark Cohen, used to refer to as angle parking. You can fit more cars in that way. So I can't see a layout like that and not think of Mark saying angle parking. And this particular letter is typical of the geographic reach of material from the geniza. So it covers not just the Mediterranean, but also the Indian Ocean. This is a letter from a trader who originally comes from Libya, but he's writing from Dahlak, which is an island archipelago in the Red Sea. And he's presumably on his way to India because that was what brought people usually to Dahlak. And he's writing to his brother-in-law back at home, talking about the terrifying sea journey. So it wasn't really until I'd been studying the geniza for a long time that I realized that the geographic remit of the material was much, much broader than what I had originally suspected when I thought that what I was studying was the Mediterranean. The material is dispersed across more than 60 libraries and private collections. And that leads to the very complicated for researchers situation of you can have the top half of a document in New York and the bottom half in Oxford, and it's up to us to kind of find these matches. So on the one hand, it's really fun because finding a join, as it's called in the business, is always like a cause for celebration. On the other hand, the challenges are very great. So it turns out that the documentary material was also not just in Hebrew script, but also in Arabic script. And often the Arabic script material were state documents. In this case, we're looking at a decree that was written from a Fatimid official, written up in the chancery in Cairo, and sent to a provincial official. We don't know where because we don't have the whole document. In fact, we have the left half of the lines only, and we don't have the entire decree. The bottom and top bits are missing. And often these state documents are recycled. So this was recycled for a Hebrew script text on the back by a scribe whom we actually know. We recognize him by his handwriting. His name is Ephraim ben Shmariah, and he was the head of the synagogue in which the geniza was found. So in this case, we see that the document was also shredded after being recycled. And as to why this one was shredded, you have to look at chapter 14 of my book. Okay, so that brings me to why I wrote this book. I wrote this book because I had heard that from pretty much everybody in my field that the medieval Middle East didn't produce documents of the kind that we have for the Ottoman period or for medieval Europe. The Ottoman archives are famously vast, and it's very much a state archive. It was something that was put together by the imperial administration. And we don't have anything like that for the Middle East before the Ottoman conquests around 1500. So there's a kind of leitmotif of these complaints that people in my field tend to make about the lack of documentation, which is one, we don't have as much as the Ottomans, and two, we don't have as much as medieval Europe. And in the second case, it turns out that that's actually an arrant falsehood. Medieval European historians know that they have a different kind of problem, which is the cartulary problem, which is that a lot of their original documents were destroyed when they were copied as summaries into collections, codices, cartularies, of which I'm showing you one here. So actually it was Adam Costo at Columbia who first pointed out to me that if you look at the period before 1200, in fact, the medieval Middle East has more preserved documents than medieval Europe does. So why does this matter? Because the depiction of the medieval Middle East as lacking in written instruments isn't just historically false, but I also think that it's been paralyzing for the field of Middle East history, and even in some sense for the discipline of history more broadly. Historians of the medieval Middle East tend to still write their histories from narrative sources. This is a narrative source from the 15th century. That's a great source for Fatimid history because it's actually a history of the Fatimids, but it was written 300 or 400 years after the events that it describes. So why write history from a long form text that was written for posterity when you can compare those long form works with documents? Few fields of historical inquiry have ignored documents to the extent that medieval Middle East history has. Documents allow you to understand society not just from the top down via the elites, but also from the bottom up via the anonymous masses and from the perspective of everyday life. So that's the great promise of the geniza, which has been borne out and continues to be borne out. And the geniza has enabled us to reconstruct the intimate details of Jewish communal life in this period. What's less well known is the fact that you can reconstruct quite a few details for non-Jewish life as well. And in the case of the research that I was undertaking towards this book, you can reconstruct the slow turnings of the wheels of the state. In fact, the medieval Middle East was a region of great administrative complexity. There were predictable procedures and thus legal and administrative stability, and even a bureaucracy. You know, the funny thing is that when I started making this argument for there being a medieval bureaucracy to people in my field, I encountered some skepticism because there's still this notion that goes back to Max Weber that bureaucracy is an invention of early modern Europe. But when I gave a lecture in Cairo 3 years ago and made this kind of long argument on behalf of medieval bureaucracy, my audience was like, well, duh, because Egyptians are disposed to believe that their country has been one giant bureaucracy since the pharaohs. So it really all depends on your perspective. From 40,000 feet, it's true that that Egypt has housed some very, very organized empires and states, and thus bureaucracies for many millennia. But in fact, the story is more complicated in interesting ways. And part of the interest lies in the fact that these documents look the way they do. So first of all, the support on which they're written is paper. The layout is very particular. The line spacing is wide. The lines are boat-shaped, so they curve slightly downward and then upward again. They have a fragmented baseline, so each Arabic word is written on its own baseline that kind of run together like stair steps. And that leads to some stacking of words at the ends of lines, and you can just kind of scan this document here. The script is a particular kind of Arabic script. It's curvilinear and proportioned, meaning it observes certain principles of classical symmetry. And the ductus, which is how medievalists call the motion of the pen over the paper, there's a variable width ductus, so you can see this kind of alternation between thin and broader strokes, which is like the sign of good calligraphy starting in the 10th century. So when I was starting to get interested in these Arabic script documents, I went to see the guru, Geoffrey Kahn at Cambridge. And we were like, hanging around his office, and I was asking him a bunch of technical questions, and he just turns to me with this kind of faraway look in his eyes, and he says, when do you suppose these documents started looking the way they did, and why? And I thought, oh, what a charmingly eccentric question. And then it actually started to like gnaw on my brain and really bother me. And I spent the next like 8 years trying to answer this question, which is essentially, how had we gotten from, there's Geoffrey Kahn's book, how had we gotten from here, this is an Umayyad decree of the early 8th century, also written in Egypt, and also written by an upper level government administrator, to here. This is another Fatimid decree of 400 years later. What had happened in the meantime? So the answer is gradually, and the rest of the answer is in my book. But essentially, the short answer is that Fatimids started drawing up documents that looked the way they did so that they would look more like they came from the Abbasid chancery, right? So this is totally paradoxical at first glance. Remember, the Fatimids wanted to beat the Abbasids at their own game. So why would they try to write documents that looked like Abbasid documents? From one side, it's a total paradox. On the other, it stands to reason. If you were an empire trying to usurp the claim of sole legitimate ruler of the Islamic Ummah, who better to imitate than the rival empire that you want to replace? So claims of legitimacy to work actually have to be recognizable as claims to legitimacy. And this is one way that the Fatimids claimed their own legitimacy, was to write documents the way the Abbasids did. But that's only one part of the explanation. The second part is the Fatimids faced a serious problem when they conquered large swaths of the Abbasid realm, and that was finding competent administrators, and finding competent administrators who would be loyal to them. So once they reached Egypt, Egypt being the agriculturally very productive and thus tax yielding region that they kind of had their eyes set on, if you want to collect taxes, don't fire the bureaucracy. That would be like a terrible and very self-destructive move. If you want to handle irrigation problems or say public health problems, there have to be smooth administrative transitions. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead is purely coincidental. So continuity of administrative practices means predictability and stability. And in other words, I was starting to understand, starting to make a connection between the continuity of administrative practices on the one hand, and the existence of institutions that were very slow to change. And that suggests that in fact, states and bureaucracies and even forms of documentation were more important in Middle East history than we'd realized. Okay, so last little bit of summary that I'll give you, the $64,000 question. did the caliphates and the sultanates of the medieval Middle East actually keep archives? So in one sense, the Middle East practically invented the whole concept of a territorial, extensive, multi-generational state, and as well as writing and archives. I mean, the only other contender really would be China for the ancient period. So the Middle East is the first place that I would look for a sophisticated system of documentation. And all the more so if you think about the legacy of specific Middle Eastern empires, the Achaemenids in Iran, the Romans who ruled large parts of the Middle East, both of whom had sophisticated archives, and some of whose administrative techniques were actually still being used in the Islamic Middle Ages. So if archives existed, then what happened to them? Where did they go and what did they look like? So to make a very long story short, when the Fatimids wanted to archive a document, they didn't archive this. That would have been wildly impractical. This is a document that in its original form might have run to as long as 8 meters. So what they would have been more sensible to do, which is in fact what they did, is to archive a much more compact bifolio. So this is, a bifolio is a sheet of paper with a fold down the middle that yields 4 different writing surfaces. And it's much smaller than the grand decree. So this type of copy of a decree, this is one that Jeffrey Kahn published in 1993, would have been the more sensible thing to archive. So that, once I realized this, I realized like I had to kind of rethink the way I thought about documents, because the huge long decrees look really grand and impressive. And because they look so grand and impressive to us, and they, of course, would have likewise impressed those who saw them or heard them read aloud, which was exactly the point. They seem to look like they must also have been important for record keeping. But in fact, they were completely unimportant for record keeping. The long scrolls were the ones that were sent out into the territory to provincial officials and to petitioners. They were not meant to be kept in the capital and to be archived in such a grand form. They were, what I say in the book is that they're instruments of performance, right? So if you think of The Who and Pete Townshend's propensity to destroy his guitars at the end of a conference, something like that is going on here, if you forgive the anachronistic analogy. So the moral of the story is rather than reifying archives and thinking that an archive is a static thing that we can just go and find and write history from, in fact, we've been looking for the wrong thing. We shouldn't expect to find a ready-made modern European style archive just waiting for historians to dust off the documents and write some books, but rather we should be attempting to understand the larger administrative system that produced and preserved and ultimately jettisoned documents as well. This is like an example of if you can't answer the question, then change the question. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there and hand it over to Arnold to ask me some questions.
Thanks, Marina. That was really wonderful. I think before I ask you a question, I do want to go back to Marina's book one more time. Francesca held it up. Francesca talked about the pictures, but I think in a book that is really about the dimensions, you can't really see. In a book that is about the dimensions of writing, it's important to understand that this is a monumental book. Francesca, maybe you could hold up your copy because it's not showing up so clearly in my, yeah. So we could see sort of the dimensions of the spine, yeah. So Marina's book talks about some extraordinarily lavish and very, very long decrees. And so I think, we should also acknowledge the monumental effort that she has made in producing this book. It's not just brilliant, it's not just beautiful, but it also has a materiality to itself. Okay, so let me begin, and I'm just gonna bring you back to the Jews. And I'm gonna ask a very basic question. Why should students of Jewish history be interested in the Fatimid chancery?
So, I don't know if they should, no, but honestly, I mean, I actually thought that I too was writing a book about Jews when I started out to write what became this book. So my first book was about the Jewish community of Egypt and Syria, and specifically infighting, which is like always a really fun thing to write about. And one of the things that I noticed when I was writing that book is that when two groups of Jews had issues with each other that they couldn't resolve by other means, they would petition the state. And so there are Fatimid petitions that actually have to do with kind of like the intimate details of Jewish communal life. And I thought that was really interesting because a lot of medieval Jewish historians, especially the 20th century ones who, like, you know, we grew up on, will tell you that that Jews never wanted non-Jewish authorities interfering in their communal life. So I thought, wow, well, okay, what's going on here? Is it just, are the Jews particular this way, or is there a kind of larger phenomenon of petitioning the state? And that's the book I thought I was writing, was Jews and the state. And then I realized that I wouldn't be able to do that responsibly unless I understood the Fatimid state. And then, like, you know, here we are 12 years later, and I'm still obsessed with the Fatimid state. So, to understand anything about the Jewish communities in the Middle Ages, you have to understand the states under whom they lived. So, in a sense, I mean, only now do I understand that this actually, like, is going to help me understand Jewish communities. But it was a long way getting there.
You kind of touched on this in your comments, and in the book you talk about it at greater length, but we often hear that the Jews in the Fatimid realm flourished politically, economically, religiously, because of a particularly hands-off, laissez-faire approach that the Fatimids adopted. You argue persuasively against viewing the Fatimid state in quite this way, that they're more proactive, right? And I guess the question then is, does that in turn require us to come up with a different way of understanding the Jews? Meaning, knowing that the Fatimid state was more proactive than we might have assumed, how does our understanding of the structural features of Jewish life, the constraints on the Jewish community, how do those things change our view of that community?
Yeah, so that's a really, really interesting question. On the one hand, when you're studying the Fatimids from the perspective of Jewish history, I think it's actually pretty reasonable to conclude that the Fatimids were laissez-faire, specifically when it came to the details of how religious communities ran their lives, right? So the idea is that the Fatimids adhered to such a specific and esoteric branch of Shiism that they didn't expect anybody else or want anybody else to adhere to it. So they were pretty much like, well, if you're not one of us, then just like do whatever you want. And to an extent, that's true. They didn't actually concern themselves with the details of how Jews, Christians, or Sunni Muslims practiced. But that doesn't mean that they were laissez-faire. And where I see the really, surprisingly hands-on running of the state is in the kind of infrastructural issues. So agriculture, specifically making sure that agriculture was as productive as possible because that was what their tax revenue depended on. And taxation. I mean, they went to great lengths to make sure that they could extract the resources of the lands that they ruled. On the other hand, and here's also where the laissez-faire idea is forgivable, even if I think it's wrong, which is we're talking about a period of human history when the population of the planet was 300 million, right? I mean, estimated obviously, but somewhere around there, just to give like a sense of proportion. So if you think about what that means in terms of how thinly spread people were, it was that much more difficult to actually run an empire, let alone a territorially extensive empire. So one of the ways that the Fatimids tried to get around this basic logistical problem, which is how can you be in more than one place at the same time? And yet you don't have a lot of people to send out into the territory. Well, one important solution is writing, right? Is documentation. But another one is relying on local elites. So one of the patterns that I started to see about how the Fatimids ran their empire is that they would kind of set up or support even certain elite groups around their realm to kind of act as surrogates. Surrogates for collecting tax, surrogates for keeping, the populace under control. In the case of Yemen, there was a group of emirs, the Sulayhids, who they set up as vassals for more than 100 years. This was just in the period when Yemen was becoming an important link in the India trade. And in the case of Syria, there are certain indications from the geniza, actually from letters exchanged among the rabbinic elite, that in fact, the Fatimids were relying on Jews, especially in Jerusalem, as kind of linchpins of taxation in Syria. So that's something that, you can kind of see it, but you don't really understand why it's so important until you understand the bigger state. The third area that I would look, and I have not yet done this, but somebody should, is in the capitation tax, the so-called poll tax. Historians refer to it as a poll tax, but it's incredibly misleading. So I try to say capitation tax. Specifically the tax that Jews and Christians had to pay. We have like sheaves and sheaves of tax receipts for the capitation tax, and to somehow put those together with the letters from the geniza that talk about what the subjective experience of paying this was like, or getting the money together to pay it, would be a really great project. So that's just like some ideas for what this means for Jewish history.
I mean, you've always been interested kind of at the point where the Jewish community and the state interact, and so this feels like a very kind of natural extension of your early work. Actually, in your first book, close readers will remember, you actually thank someone for opening a trap door to a second project. Is this that second project that you were thinking of then, or have things kind of taken several turns since then?
Yeah, they've taken several turns. So I was trained as a Jewish historian, and we all had to learn a lot of other history, obviously, but for me, the social history of the medieval Middle East was something that I kind of like aspired to know more about, but I never imagined myself as an expert in the broader society, and let alone in the state. So when I started out to write the book that ultimately, after a couple of turns of the screw, became this book, I very much thought that it was going to be a book about Jews, specifically. How did Jews experience the state? And then kind of there was a bit of mission creep, and I started getting interested in the question of, well, what can we learn about the state from Jewish sources that we can't know otherwise? In other words, we have this amazing opportunity that the geniza affords us to give us a kind of like these micro histories. So can we learn something about the user end of the state that would tell us something new, right, about what medieval Middle Eastern governments looked like to kind of your average everyday person on the ground? And that was what the book seemed to be doing for a while. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I realized that there was so little I actually understood about the state. And in fact, what the Lost Archive is an introduction to the book that I was writing, and whether or not I'll actually write that book remains to be seen. But yeah, it's extraordinary to me, actually, when I look back on it, that one of the things that got me interested in all this was the petition and response procedure. So not just what was it like for Jews to petition the Fatimid state, but also why did the Fatimids care? Why did they let people petition them? And why are there so many petitions from kind of, otherwise totally anonymous individuals who don't seem very important? Why did the Fatimids listen to people's problems? And when I started to research that, there were like 2 paragraphs literally in secondary literature on the petition and response procedure in terms of the process. Like, how does it actually work? Like, where do you get your petition written? Where do you bring it? Do you have to wait at the palace door for an answer? That kind of thing. And those two paragraphs were based on, one was a Makrizi, the Mamluk historian I mentioned earlier, and another was a contemporary of his. And I thought, okay, well, that's pretty much all we need to know. And then I realized that there's much, much more going on. If you try to look at it from the side of the documents, you can actually learn more about procedure. And even at that point, I thought, okay, once I've like figured out petitioning, I figured out the Fatimid state. But that was before I understood that, like, no, you actually have to figure out taxation if you want to understand anything about anything. So those are all the stages of Mission Creek.
Okay, you brought up the Chancery, so I want to follow up with that. You did some really amazing detective work, recreating the bustling scene inside the Central Chancery office. And your main guide here is Ibn Sayrafi. Do we know, and this may not be a fair question, but do we know anything about the actual physical conditions of the Chancery? And I'm thinking, you know, it was an office, presumably. Was it close to the ruler's residence? I'm intrigued by the idea of the Chancery as the mouthpiece of the ruler, and then sort of wondering how much actual day-to-day contact would there have been between the Chancery officials and the rulers, whether it's the vizier or the caliph. Also, did Chancery scribes play any role in those extravagant public ceremonies that the Fatimids ran? Yeah, so anything you can share about that, I think would be fascinating.
Yeah, chanceries are somehow fascinating places. I totally agree with you on that. And there's so much more we want to know about them. So so when Arnold refers to ceremonies, I mean, this is something actually that's really like kind of hovering in a background and really important in all the scholarship, is the fact that most of the later historians, like Mamluk era historians who wrote about the Fatimids, wrote about their public ceremonies. So the Fatimids kind of became like famous for posterity as the rulers who would like parade around Cairo for various, you know, holidays and reasons and occasions, and kind of generally make a show of being there and having these like processions and stuff. And we do know that in later periods, like the Mamluk period also had its own set of processions. Documents played a role in those. But there's no evidence that they played a role in Fatimid processions, except there are these kind of like mythologized little vignettes of caliphs, you know, riding out on horseback in the middle of the night and hearing like petitioners. And, you know, there's a certain amount of like, you know, an old lady once handed the caliph a petition kind of thing. But otherwise, these are really different realms. Which was a kind of clue to me that what we thought we knew about the Fatimids was what people, you know, had access to and how people memorialized them. But what's going on in the inner sanctum, right? How is the state actually running when you get down to the level of the bureaucrats, right? So, you know, we tend to think of like bureaucracy and administration as unbelievably boring subjects. Like, I'll never think that again, because when you actually try to reconstruct it, you think like, how did anybody get anything done, right? So one of I mean, I you know, having kind of tried to make my way through the documents that I could find, it seemed pretty evident to me that the head of the chancery and the vizier were in close contact with each other. So the vizier being basically the you know, the kind of chief operating officer, and the head of the chancery being, you know, the chief bureaucrat. So they were tightly linked. But as to where the caliph fit in, it's still not clear to me. You know, was the caliph kind of like off meditating all day, or actually making policy? And what was frustrating to me, so Ibn Sayrafi wrote this guide to the chancery in 1130. He was the head of the Fatimid chancery, and he was like, okay, I'm going to sit down and actually like tell you how this place runs. But he wasn't doing that because he wanted to tell us how the place runs. He was doing that because there was an autocratic vizier who had just assumed the office and was terrifying. And Ibn Sayrafi wanted to prove how indispensable he was. So he was like, you know, here's what you need in order to run a good chancery. And I have to say that, like, reading Ibn Asaydafi's book, I had read it many times. I never thought I would write anything about it because I'm really afraid of any text that's more than 1 page long. This is one of the, like, professional deformations of working with documents. But when I finally started to think about it based on what I was seeing in the documents, things started to make sense to me, in the sense that I could see the assembly line of document production. But one of the things that I was never able to figure out is exactly where the chancery was or what it looked like. And part of the reason for that, actually, Ibn Asaydafi gives us, which is, he says, this guide is meant as a guide for chancery officials, and a copy of it should sit in the chancery at all times. And it turns out that only one copy of this book survived. And it survived alongside an Ayyubid, they were the dynasty after the Fatimids, an Ayyubid fiscal manual copied by the same scribe around 1200, meaning it probably was sitting in the chancery for a good long time. And so if the book is available only in the chancery, then you don't need to describe what the chancery looks like, because you're already standing in it if you have access to the book. So when I read that line, I said, oh, this is really hopeless. On the other hand, it must be said that the Fatimid Palatine complex, which is now, I mean, it's a distinctive area of Cairo. Like, you go there and you know exactly where the walls were or are, because some of the walls are still standing. You can walk end to end in an hour, right? So it's not like they're very far from each other. But as far as the specifics of where the chancery was, I don't know.
You talk a lot about the Fatimid documents as kind of the performance of statecraft, the performance of rule. And how does that relate to what we know about literacy? In other words, these were texts. On some level, they were to be read, but they obviously operated on other levels as well. So can you just unpack that a little bit and sort of talk about how these texts would have worked beyond just the realm of the literate who were receiving them?
Yeah, so we do know that there are a couple of different kinds of decrees. There were the decrees that were meant for other officials, which were never meant to be read aloud. And then there were public decrees. And we do have some written evidence to the effect of, you know, a decree that says this decree shall be read aloud in all of the public squares of whatever. So we know that there was some oral communication between the upper echelons of the government and kind of people in general. But where I started to get really interested in this problem was, I mean, you can kind of look at this either from the Jewish side or from the Fatimid bureaucratic side. From the Jewish side, when you look at, you know how, like, you'll have like a legal document, and you have a bunch of signatures at the bottom, and some of the signatures are in a very awkward kind of, you know, square Hebrew script, meaning that the person kind of learned to write basic Hebrew, but they never really went beyond that. So they're not writing like a flowing semi-cursive or something like that. So you have the exact same phenomenon with bureaucratic documents, which is you have the people whose writing was fantastic and could have produced, you know, any kind of text they've been asked to produce. You had the people who only knew how to write the kind of text that they knew how to write. And then you have the people whose handwriting was just like absolutely terrible, and they could only write very technical texts. So like the tax receipts, for example, the fiscal administrators, and this is like more and more true the farther away from Cairo you go, that the fiscal hands are written in a kind of code, like they're, you know, paleographically, they're a total nightmare to learn to read. So what I started to understand is, like, you know, we tend to think of literacy as black and white, like either you know how to read or you don't. But actually there are levels of literacy and degrees of literacy. There's kind of functional literacy, and then, you know, the kind of all around complete literacy where you can read any text even if you've never seen it before. That was really reserved for very, very few people. So what that meant is that there was going to be a lot of mediation between texts and people. Even people who could read would often hear certain kinds of texts recited more than read. This is also in a context where the vast majority of the long form texts that are produced are being copied, not on the basis of written exemplars, but on the basis of oral recitation. So this is like a really exciting area of Middle Eastern studies right now, is the notes that you find in the margins and on the first few pages of manuscripts that say like who heard this and when, and you can actually get the sense that a lot of texts were meant to be heard much more than they were meant to be read.
Okay, sticking with the basics just for another minute or two. One thing I was shocked to learn, one of the many things I was shocked to learn reading the book, was that it was common practice not to have writing tables. Did I get that right? And how in the world did you produce an 8 or 9 meter rotulus in beautiful calligraphy without using a writing table?
So let me just like, put this up front and center. I didn't really do like an in-depth investigation of this question. So it could well be that there's evidence that I simply didn't find, didn't look for, didn't uncover. But from what I was seeing from my kind of vantage point of the Fatimid bureaucracy, there were not writing tables. That wasn't the typical way people wrote. They would write either cross-legged on the floor, or they would put a piece of paper, put the paper on their knee, right? A board was also something that you could use to kind of, interpose between your knee and the actual writing surface. But it meant that when you're writing these really, really long rotuli, there was going to be a lot of paper kind of falling all over the place. And in fact, there is a manuscript, I have a couple of illustrations from it in the book, that shows a chancery scribe writing one of these rotuli. And the arrangement is very interesting to see, because he has his pen box on one side, and then he has the text that he's copying from on another side, and then he is writing with the thing on his lap, basically. And that was where I said, wow, they really were able to do some pretty amazing calligraphy, given we think of tables as being indispensable for good handwriting, but it turns out they're not.
Okay, from reading and writing to pruning. Pruning comes up a lot in the book. And I really love the way you present it as kind of an alternative, this idea of kind of intentionally offloading and fairly regularly kind of offloading no longer needed documents. You present that as an alternative to the idea that document dispersal happens as a result of catastrophe, right? We don't need to posit catastrophe. We can think of more sort of ordinary bureaucratic means of deacquisition material. I'm asking this in part because I have an inbox with many unread emails that I do not know how to get rid of. How do you prune? How does one actually do that? Were there regular reviews of the contents when this would have happened? One thing that came to my mind, the very famous ethical will of Judah ibn Tibon, one of my favorite medieval texts, in which he recommends regularly reviewing one's library, every month reviewing the Hebrew books, every 2 months reviewing the Arabic books, keeping stock. It sounds like a full-time job, and that's just a personal library. How in the world do you keep track of what you have in a state archive?
Right. So part of the answer to the question is, what is the state actually trying to do? Is its goal to preserve everything, or is its goal to preserve the bare minimum? And here it's really interesting, right? Because when I was talking about Egypt as being like, having this very long history of bureaucracy, but then the devil's in the details, I was fascinated to get to know the work of a Roman historian named Anna Dolganov, who is now in Vienna and who did her PhD at Princeton with Brent Shaw. And she specifically wrote on archiving under the Romans on the basis of not just the literary sources that Roman historians use, but also of papyri. And one of the things that she discovered is an incredible text where these archivists from one of the districts in Egypt, the Arsinoite nome, are writing to their superior and saying, when we arrived in the Arsinoite nome and became its archivists, we were confronted with a horrible sight, which was piles and piles of papyrus on the floor. and like mice were eating through them, and we had no idea what to do. And then we learned that in fact, several generations of archivists before us had the same problem, and it had gotten so out of control that nobody could handle it. So basically writing to, you know, the boss and saying like, it's not our fault, like, please, like, tell us what to do about this. And she constructs the archiving system of Roman Egypt and discovers that in fact, what the Romans aimed to do was to have everything in triplicate. So they wanted a local copy, they wanted a central copy, and then they wanted a copy in the, like, you know, provincial center. And that was basically what led to problems, is there was no way to have an archiving system that was that complete. What I discovered with the Fatimids is, at least as far as I can reconstruct it, that the Fatimids' goal was not to have a triplicate of everything. Their goal was to have one copy, and that copy was going to be in the chancery in Cairo. There were registers, right, that would take kind of notes, like a one-line note on a full document saying, you know, summarizing it in the provinces. But in terms of like a full copy of these documents, they were really only meant to be archived in Cairo. And as soon as you kind of put that as your goal, the whole system becomes much, much more simple to keep. And we do have a sense of like also how it was organized by month and year and by place. But you know, you draw the analogy with email, and of course, you know, we're all like, all academics have this problem of email, and it's, you know, I've come to understand that I'm doing it wrong, which is when I respond to an email, I want to like do a full, really thoughtful response, as a result of which I never respond. And then I have these colleagues who will give you like, you know, the 3-word, totally inadequate response, but they'll give it to you within an hour. And in a way that's so much more satisfying. So I would say that the Fatimas were kind of like that colleague who's always writing you a really short email, but very promptly. Whereas I'm like, you know, the Roman archivists who are just like, it's too much and you can't do it.
Great, okay, I'll keep that in mind. Okay, question about sort of the reception of this work. So you've spoken about this to many different kinds of audiences. I'm curious if you've noted differences in the way Jewish studies audiences, as opposed to Islamic studies audiences, have received this. Have those experiences left you with any impressions about the state of geniza research, its future, maybe future directions it should take, or yeah, any sort of thoughts about how presenting this material has kind of, how you've experienced them?
Yeah, it's funny because in a way, I mean, if we can talk about a reception, right, it's been less than a year, but just from what I can kind of, you know, gauge from the kinds of questions I've gotten from people when I've spoken about the book, in a way, it's totally redolent of the exact problem that I was like writing the book to try to address, which is most people who follow Jewish studies have heard of the geniza. So that means that, you know, they're totally aware of the fact that it's not just that there are documents, it's that like there are more documents than even all the documentary geniza scholars working today could possibly ever get through, you know, working together in their lifetime. Like there's so much when it comes to documentation. And so I think it's less surprising in some ways to people coming at it from the Jewish studies side to see that the documentation extends beyond the Jews and into even, you know, the kind of intimate realms of Islamic governmentality. I think that's not actually such a surprise. It's, you know, it's a little bit like wacky that, you know, somebody should go from the Jewish studies direction into this like deep state, you know, direction, but whatever, that's fine. But the point is like that there are documents is not the surprise. Whereas for Islamic studies, I think it's still kind of out there. Like, you know, I had this really like wonderful experience on Tuesday where I was talking at the graduate student book club at the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Chicago. And the person who was my interlocutor, Ahmed Shamsi, is an amazing historian of Islamic law and Islamic intellectual culture more broadly. And what that means is that you know, not only is he an expert on reading long form texts, but he really believes in the endeavor. and rightly so. I mean, he's done amazing work. And at some point he jokingly accused me of an anti-literary bias, right? He's like, well, you don't like long text. And I was like, well, actually that's kind of true that I don't, but I think there's such an ingrained habit in Islamic studies to kind of value the literature that's written for posterity, whether it's chronicles or legal codes or biographical dictionaries. These are the works that people take more seriously because they're kind of intellectual works. Whereas, this nasty little tax receipt that is like hard to read and talks about tiny quantities of money just seems so totally insignificant compared to like a chronicle that you read about a caliph. So in a way, I guess I'm kind of still making the case. On the other hand, it has to be said also that I think that a lot of people who do medieval Middle Eastern history, if they had access to the documents, they would go there. I think there's also a perception that, well, the geniza is so hard to use, right? It's like there's 60 plus library collections. There are all these like shelf marks. You have to figure out all these arcane systems of classification. It's all digitized now, but the websites aren't always that easy to use, that kind of thing. There's this sense that, we could never do that because the training is just so intensive. And by the way, that's a sense I think that's also very much shared about Arabic papyrology, right? It's not even like a Hebrew script barrier that people are talking about. It's like any form of documentary text is just considered to be so kind of vastly more complicated than what you would need to work on, nice fat volumes that contain a lot of information.
Okay, I think we're going to be turning it over soon to audience questions, I think. So I guess this will be my last question, and then I guess we can turn it over. So I'm wondering about the geniza itself, meaning the effort to accumulate no longer needed writings. Has all of this thinking about archiving led you to any new insights about the Jewish community? Are there attitudes about paper? I mean, you alluded to this a little bit in your comments, but I would love to hear more. Are there attitudes about paper, its significance, what it means to hold on to it, what it means to let it go, that can perhaps help us better understand the Cairo geniza itself as an accumulation of discarded text?
Yeah, I had to try and understand at some point the economics of paper. Both the origins of paper as a writing material in the Middle East, because it came from China via Central Asia. It came a bit more indirectly than what we had always thought. And it supplanted papyrus even in Egypt in such a short period that you wonder to yourself, okay, well, what was exactly going on here? Papyrus was cheap, so paper couldn't have been that expensive. On the other hand, if paper was a cheap writing material, then why are people reusing it to the point of even like writing between the lines of texts? Like what's with this kind of parsimonious attitude towards paper? And so I tried to do some of the math, and one of the really frustrating things about trying to understand the economics of, I think, any commodity based on trade letters from the geniza is that you just can't figure out the quantities all the time. Like when they talk about paper, they talk about a dest of paper or a rizma of paper, or these technical terms that actually you have no idea what the quantity really means. So you know how much they paid per dest, but how much is a dest? It's like an armload. Well, how much is an armload? That kind of thing. But from what I could kind of figure out from the way people talked about the acquisition of paper, it wasn't actually very expensive. So why then are people so parsimonious about it? What I started to suspect is that there was a general attitude towards text, and not just text in Hebrew script, any text, that you simply didn't throw it away. And second, there was a general attitude towards stuff in general, that you didn't throw it away. So I'll just take each in turn. So the issue with writing, this really kind of like the penny dropped when I started to to take the blinders off and look beyond the geniza. There's this, also very, very large cache of both literary and documentary texts that were preserved in a structure inside the courtyard of the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus that seems to have contained a very similar mix of texts that were written for posterity and texts that were just kind of like decaying and fragmented and falling apart, as the Cairo Geniza did, as the Cairo Synagogue in Cairo did. And there are other examples, even examples from well beyond the Islamic world. I mean, all over the perimeter of the Taklamakan Desert, these Silk Road caches have a very similar story where you have a kind of decaying pile of written material that's sealed up behind a wall and then doesn't get found again for another, several hundred years. So this got me to thinking that text in general, we just have a different attitude towards text from what people did in a world in which literacy could not be taken for granted. It's not that it was magical, and it's not that it had some kind of like, sacred property necessarily, even though that's what we always thought about the Geniza, that it was because the name of God in Hebrew script is sacred and can't be destroyed. I think there was a more general attitude that text is not sacred, but nonetheless is something that shouldn't be destroyed. And then the other piece of this, the handmade bit, is we're always asking ourselves as teachers, how can I make this interesting to undergraduates who have no business caring about this? And so I've been teaching a course for the last few years on the material culture of medieval Cairo, and it's such a weird topic, right? So I thought, okay, well, to make this interesting to people, maybe I can have them like do some crafts projects. So we make paper, we cook ink based on various recipes, we cook food, and we try to carve rock crystal, which is like a planned failure because you look at these gorgeous Fatimid rock crystal ewers that you see in museums, and it turns out like you actually can't carve one of those unless you've been learning to carve since you were 3. It's kind of like, like handing the students a lump of rock crystal and a little diamond tipped implement and saying, go carve, is like handing somebody a Stradivarius and like sheet music, and they've never touched a violin before, and saying like, play Bach beautifully. Like, it's that level of skill. So that got me thinking a lot about cultures of the handmade, which is something that, we just don't have access to anymore because we live in a world of the machine made. And when everything is handmade, you reuse things. You use all parts of the animal, as it were, and then you reuse all parts of the animal. So that's pretty much the direction that I went in with that.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Marina and Arnold. This has been fascinating. There are already several questions that came in. The first is from Maud Kozodoy, who's asking, were these decrees read publicly? If so, do we see any parallel phenomenon among Jews, either in terms of the various Megillot texts, such as the ones that you studied with Sasha Stern, or in terms of the format of writing, were any official Geonic pronouncements written on rotuli with a similar type of format?
Excellent question. Hi, Maud. Thank you for that really, really good question. So we actually know more about public reading in synagogues than we do about public reading of the government documents. We have quite a bit of documentation on that. And it wasn't just the liturgical reading, it's also that, that communal pronouncements were read aloud. And as far as the rotuli go, this is like a totally fascinating area. I mean, I owe everything here to Judith Elshovi-Schlanger in Paris, who discovered that the rotulus, the long vertical scroll, as a book form, right? She calls this the third form of the Hebrew book in the Middle Ages, served a very specific purpose, which is it was meant for notes, kind of mnemonic notes that you would use towards a public recitation. So specifically, if a text was meant either as kind of performance notes or else as your own private copy, but was never meant to be circulated in writing, you would write it on a rotulus. And it was a huge insight because it started to make sense of the fact that a large quantity of the reuses that I was seeing on these state documents was for liturgical poetry. So liturgical poetry, it's like a really interesting phenomenon in Judaism because, when you go to a synagogue today, the liturgical poetry that exists a lot of it is medieval, but it's frozen, it's fixed, right? You say the same, you do the same liturgical poetry, you know, like for every cycle of the year, whereas in the Middle Ages, the cantor's job was to compose new poetry. So the cantors are constantly writing poems, and that's also why, like, you know, 25% of the geniza is liturgical poetry, and it also meant that they were constantly in need of writing material to do it on, but they weren't writing formal texts that were meant to be preserved. It was just like, okay, this is like the song that I composed for this week, and then they have their little like note on the cocktail napkin kind of thing. So, so some of the publicly recited material was on rotuli, on the vertical scrolls, but certainly not all of it. It seems to have been very, very specific genres. And then of course, there's the canonical material recited in the synagogue, which was not going to be on a vertical scroll, but on a horizontal scroll. These were, you know, it might seem similar to us because they're both scrolls, but actually they're very, very different technologies for people interacting with text in the Middle Ages.
The next question is from Noam Siena, who's building on your comments on the handmade. Thanks you for your wonderful talk, for your pioneering and eminently readable work. And he says, as a book historian, I am fully in agreement with your insistence on engaging the material texts themselves and valuing the ancillary skills like paleography and codicology. Could you say more about why you believe it is so important methodologically to try to understand the physical documents themselves and how they were made?
I know, thank you for that really excellent question. So there are two reasons, just like off the top of my head, why I would really recommend the experience of engaging with the physical text to anybody who studies texts. One is that the people who wrote these texts did, which is to say that when these chancery calligraphers are writing with very wide line spacing, they're actually saying something by doing that. My colleague Tamara Leithy calls this the sovereign privilege of waste, right? So they're trying to communicate something by using a particular kind of layout. Or likewise, if you're using a rotulus that's, you know, reused from something else to write down a liturgical poem, you're doing that for a reason. There's a kind of specific set of technologies that you're engaging. And so given how consistent they are about this, we kind of have to understand it. It's just that because we come from a field that grew up as a philological field, we're focused on words. We're not so much focused on containers, right? So we can learn more. The containers contain, they have evidence that we can't overlook. But the other thing, I mean, why I got interested in the material text is a bit different, which is I'm interested in reuse. And I'm interested in reuse because let's say you have a legal document on one side of a piece of paper, and then you have a letter on the other side of the piece of paper. And I wanted to know, well, how did the legal document get into the hands of the person who wrote the letter? Or how did the decree, the shredded decree, get into the hands of the person who wrote a Hebrew liturgical poem on the back? There's information there in the transfer from point A to point B that if you separate those things, you're actually losing information. This is actually a really big issue for, so I run a database called the Princeton Geniza Project, and it's been around since 1985. It was founded by Mark Cohen. And one of the issues that we're constantly grappling with is how do we actually represent these texts digitally? Because on the one hand, you want a transcription of a letter as a discrete document, as a discrete text. But on the other hand, you don't want to separate it from the perhaps equally interesting text that's on the other side. And so how do you model that in terms of relational data? That's like, you know, very, very nerdy digital humanities question that I think about a lot, but it's, you don't want to lose information. That's the basic principle.
The next question comes from the perspective of a librarian archivist, and it's from Chaim Gottschalk. And he says, you alluded, the perspective that you alluded to of the librarian/archivist, was there an intent to just preserve the documents in the chancery? Or would you say there was an idea to preserve in order to reference the documents? Or is this very hard to tell?
That's a great question. Actually, the intent was very much to reference, not simply to preserve for the sake of preservation. And you can see this from both sides. So let me just see if I can share my screen, and it will be so much easier to make this point with the image. So if you take a look at this bifolio archival copy that I was telling you about earlier, up here on the upper left-hand corner of, this would have been the front cover, as it were, of the pamphlet, of the bifolio, you have an archival marking that has a summary of the entire case in 3 lines, right? So that's like one example. We have other examples of single-page documents where there's a summary of the case, you know, in like 2 words on the side of the page. You can see that the idea is that you should be able to kind of like rifle through the whole stack of papers and immediately just see what's in them without having to actually sit and read the whole document. So that's one way we see it. The other way we see it is you can actually see in government documents, especially petitions, people will write and say, can you please check the archives because I know this is in there. You know, there is proof of this in the archives. And fascinatingly, the word that they use for archives is diwan, which is the same word for government office. So there's this idea that these are synonymous and that they should be available to the bureaucrats to refer to when needed. So it's all about the written proof.
The next question comes from Jacob Malky, who's wondering if there are any documents in Latin in the Latin alphabet, and if so, what is the main content?
This is such an interesting question. So when I said that most of what's in the geniza dates from between 950 and 1250, I was actually leaving out a really important other chunk of information, which is there are large deposits of material from the 16th and the 19th century that survive in the Cairo geniza that have not really, like, you know, had their day in court, as it were. I mean, there are people who are working on them now, but it's like there's so much more to be done. And the reason for the big uptick in documentation in the 16th century was the Spanish expulsion. So there were refugees from the Iberian Peninsula who found their way to Egypt, especially in the beginning of the 16th century, so it wasn't immediate. And so what that means is that instead of just having texts in Arabic and Judeo-Arabic, which is Arabic and Hebrew characters, you also have Ladino. So medieval Castilian in Hebrew characters. And then you also have some texts written in Romance and Latin script, although they're fewer than the ones written in Hebrew script. So that's just like one example. There's a couple of medieval Latin texts here and there. The amount of Latin script increases as you move towards the 19th century. It's certainly in the minority, just when you look at the big numbers, but there is stuff there. And I have to say, it's for me, it's like totally fascinating when you see the Latin script text and the Arabic or Hebrew script text side by side. The Latin script text looks so antiquated to me. It's like this really crazy curlicue writing that just looks completely different from anything we know, whereas actually Hebrew and Arabic calligraphy have changed less. Just as, you know, the Arabic language has changed much less than, say, the English language since the 14th century. So that's always like really striking when I look at it.
The next question comes from Ronald Schechter, who is saying, this is amazing, Marina. How can you do social history using the documents in the geniza?
Hi, Ron. Yeah, so, well, it totally depends on what kind of document you're looking at. With the kind of thing that I was doing in the Lost Archive, looking at these bureaucratic documents, I kept remembering something that my friend Ramzi Ruihi, who's a historian of medieval North Africa, once said to me when we were graduate students. He said, you know, even the state has a social history. And I said, yes, okay. So I really am doing social history of the bureaucracy. But the vast majority of the documents that we know and love from the geniza are letters and legal documents. And these are documents that are just begging to have social history written from them. The letters in particular, letters are amazing documents for social history because you really get a sense of of relationships. And even the legal text, even if you have a legal deed that is like, 75% formulary and the case is just crammed into a few little lines, if you really read it carefully, you can reconstruct an enormous amount of context. Actually, I mentioned Judith Olshawy-Schlanger, this paleographer and codicologist from Paris who worked on the rotulus as a form of the Hebrew book. So I just went to a seminar of hers on Tuesday morning in Oxford. This is like so great about Zoom. You can be in like 5 cities in the same day. So I was in Oxford on Tuesday in this seminar that she gave, and she was reading a book list. So there were like maybe 10 lines of text, and all it was titles of books. But when she read this book list, it came alive in this way that was extraordinary, because what she pointed out is this is a book list that's not written by the person who owns the books. And it's not written by the scribe who wrote the books. It's written by the bookseller who commissioned the scribes to copy these particular works and send them to a particular person on the Iberian Peninsula. And so she kind of reconstructs this whole network of bookselling from a list. So I think the answer, Ron, to your question is interpretation, right? You have to sit and really think about what are the circumstances that produce this document, not just what is the manifest content of the document.
I'm going to ask a question myself, and I am very curious to hear more about the petitions. As someone who works on the 18th century, we love petitions. It's such a common historical, source. And so I wonder, what are the petitions that you've looked at? What kind of legal requests did you find the most? What can we learn from these petitions about the formulas and also beyond the formulas?
Yeah, the petitions are amazing. I totally agree. They're very charismatic sources, because they contain these little sob stories. And then of course you have to figure out, well, how Saab really was the story, or was it just kind of rhetoric? And they're also fascinating sources because, exactly as you say, you have petitions from the 18th century, petitions from, antiquity. I mean, they're kind of constant in the work that we do. And I sort of have this pipe dream. I don't know if this will really happen, but it would be so great to have a comparative petitioning conference, right? We should think about this, Francesca. So what's fascinating is when people choose to petition the state, so the vizier, the caliph, and other high-ranking government officials, versus when they're going to take their case to a legal court. So we very kind of blithely talk about Islamic law as if it's one thing, but actually it's many things. And not just because there are different legal schools, but because the sovereign tribunals are producing legal opinions. I mean, they're producing legally binding decisions. And the reason that their decisions are legally binding isn't that the Islamic, jurists and legal experts say that they're legally binding. They're legally binding because they have the means of coercion at their disposal, because they can actually send, troops or police after the person if they don't adhere to the decision. So state-sponsored law in the Islamic world is also Islamic law, but it's not what we mean when we talk about Islamic law, right? So what does this mean for you, as the petitioner? So Oded Zinger, who writes about legal culture in the Cairo geniza world, and specifically about women and rabbinical courts, he figured this incredible thing out, which is that women, when they had a brother or a father or an uncle or a husband who was willing to come and defend them or stand beside them in a rabbinical court, had a chance of actually getting their way. Whereas a woman who was unprotected, right, who did not have a male figure protecting her, had very little recourse, actually. Especially if her brother or uncle or father or husband happened to be buddy with the people in the rabbinical establishment. And so these were the women who would appeal to the state. And they were also the women who would threaten to appeal to the state. So you have these letters where women are like, I'm going to take my case to the Sultan, kind of thing. And the reason they're doing this is because they understand that this is this is kind of like the trump card that they have when it comes to the rabbinical courts. So you know, there's enormous variety of things about which people petition, but you do see women as petitioners. I would not say disproportionately. I would say you see, you know, more than you'd expect. But interestingly enough, the state officials say the same thing. They say, you know, our job is to hear the complaints of unprotected women. And they specifically describe them as unprotected, because if they're protected, they're not coming to us, they're going, you know, to the Qadi courts.
Sorry, we have time for only one last question. And it's a question from Ilana Tahan from the British Library, who's asking, for your research, have you consulted geniza material held in the British Library, and how much has the Friedberg Geniza Project helped in researching for and writing the book?
Hi, Ilana, it's really nice to see you. So the British Library Geniza collection was extremely important to the research that I was doing. And the fact that it's all been digitized on the Friedberg Geniza Project website it's what made this project possible. Let me just back up for a second and say, you know, Arnold and I, and probably a lot of you out there, we wrote our dissertations before digitization. And that meant that, you know, either we were looking at printed editions of material, or we had to, like, you know, go look at microfilm, which is horrible, or, you know, get on an airplane and eat like terrible, like cafeteria food, or whatever it is that people do when they look at manuscripts. But it's much more complicated than looking at a digital image is. And the digital image has actually created this kind of, you know, material text revolution. We all pay more attention to the material aspects of the text now that we can actually look at the images more easily than we could before. So that's the first thing that has to be said. But the British Library in particular this is like an incredible experience, because I remember, actually, Ilana, this is when I first met you. I was in the British Library in, I think it was 2011, looking through some manuscripts, and I found something that I was like, you know, like you find something and you're like, this does not fit any of the schemes that I had drawn up in my mind. One of the things that I had always believed is that paper became important for governments in the medieval Middle East because paper can't be erased. Because parchment can be erased, and so can papyrus. They can be palimpsested. You would never palimpsest papyrus because it's cheap, but parchment is really expensive and hard to produce. So you can, you know, scrape off the ink and reuse it, and that's what palimpsests are. Whereas paper, if you try to palimpsest it, if you try to scrape off the ink, you're actually going to destroy the surface of the paper. So nobody would ever do that. So of course, governments loved it because you can't forge something on paper. It's unfalsifiable. This is what I believe. This is what, like, everybody who'd written on Islamic paper the last 120 years had said. And I get to the British Library and I look at this recycled decree that I knew about because I'd seen a digital image, and I start staring at it, and I realized that somebody had actually tried to erase the government decree in order to write a Judeo-Arabic grammatical treatise over it. And they gave up and failed and decided to write between the lines, but they didn't know that paper could not be palimpsest. They had to learn that by experience. And that was like, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. The other reason that was an important document for me is that, so I have like a really terrible visual memory, and it's to the point where, like, I have an awful sense of direction because I can never remember landmarks or where I was. And, you know, this is like, I'm the butt of jokes in my family. But it turned out that the more digital images I was looking at, the more my capacity to actually remember things visually was increasing. And I never forgot that text from the British Library. And 4 years later, I looked at another text and I said, that's a join for that thing I saw in the British Library in 2011. So I have a soft spot for the British Library for that reason.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, our time for tonight is up. Thank you so much, Marina, for such a lively conversation. Thank you, Arnold, for all your questions. And thank you all for coming. It's been a delight. We have a program coming up on December 3rd at 12 noon. That's a Thursday. And it will be a conversation with Deborah Kaplan about her recent book, The Patrons and Their Poor. Please stay tuned for that. If you'd like to, again, learn about our programs, please email us at the email address that you find in the chat box. Again, thank you so much for coming. Have a good night.